All right, this is our second lesson in Latin grammar. What we'd like to do in this second lesson, and what we'll try to do in every lesson, is take some time to review what we did in the previous lesson or lessons, then introduce the new content, talk about it a little bit, make sure we understand the content and also understand why it's important. And then we'll wrap up as soon as we're through with our lesson. So in our first lesson of Latin grammar, we talked about orthography. We talked about the study of the letters and their sounds. And I'm going to flip over to the book here. We looked at chapter 1 on letters. We talked about the Latin alphabet. We said that there are 23 letters in the Latin alphabet. We went through all those letters and their names and their sounds. We said that Latin is a very easy language to learn because every letter has just one sound. There's no complicated phonics like in English. We don't have silent letters and all kinds of wacky spellings like we have in English. The only problem in the study of Latin is that there are two different pronunciations. There's classical pronunciation, which is actually much easier, because it's really true in classical Latin that there's only one pronunciation for every letter, and it's always the same. But then later in history, as the Christian church developed in Europe, the pronunciation of Latin changed, and we call that ecclesiastical Latin. And there are a few rules that we have to learn to understand the difference between classical and ecclesiastical pronunciation, but they're really not difficult. And if you listen to Latin prayers or if you listen to Latin hymns, you'll know everything you need to know about ecclesiastical pronunciation. It's really not complicated. But we said there are 23 letters in Latin, and we talked about how there are 24 in Greek and 26 in English, and I told you to think about why there might be fewer letters in one language than in another. The second rule was that letters are divided into vowels and consonants, and we talked about the difference between vowels and consonants. We said vowels are sounds that are made with the voice alone. We talked about how we make sounds with our voices, with our mouths, and there are only so many sounds we can make. We can't make a million different sounds. There are only so many different sounds we can make. We can only make a few sounds. If you think about the vowels, and if I were to ask you to try to think about how you could make another vowel or a different vowel, you really can't. The sounds that we can make, we use them in speech. There are no other sounds. If I were to say to you to try to think about a consonant that you can make, a sound that you can make that isn't one of the consonants, you're going to find that you can't make a different sound. All of the sounds that we can make, we use them in speech. They're already represented by letters. Okay? So there can't be 300 letters. There can't be 300 different sounds. There's only so many sounds that we can make with our mouths. And those sounds are represented by letters. Okay? So that's a good challenge for you, to try to think of a vowel sound or a consonant sound that you can make with your mouth that isn't already included in the alphabet or symbolized by the letters of the alphabet. I don't think you'll find that there is any. We talked about 6 vowels in Latin: a, e, I, o, u, and upsilon. And we said that upsilon is actually a Greek vowel that's found only in Greek words, right? So upsilon really isn't a Latin vowel. It's really a Greek vowel, and it's only found in words that are borrowed from Greek. We learned the rest of the letters are called consonants, which are joined together with vowels. We said that a syllable is made out of one or more letters. So we can have a syllable with just one letter. How? If it's a vowel, right? We can have a syllable of just one letter if it's a vowel. And then we talked about diphthongs. We talked about certain pairs of vowels that are always kept together. They're treated like a pair of married people. We always keep them together. There are 6 diphthongs, and they're listed there in the 7th rule of chapter 1. And then we learned in the 8th rule that speech is made of syllables, or a word is made of syllables, and a word can be made of just one syllable or of many syllables. And then lastly, a sentence, oratio, a sentence is made up of words. What's important for you to understand, and we're going to study this in classical reasoning. Let's just talk about this a little bit. In our minds, so here I'm going to draw a nice little happy guy, and in his mind, I'll draw a thought bubble. In our minds, there are a couple of different things going on, okay? We have simple thoughts in our minds, simple ideas. For example, you may think of a tree, and you may have an idea of a tree in your mind. You can close your eyes and think, and you can see in your mind an image of a tree. That's called your imagination. The ability to see images in your mind. That's your imagination. Okay? When we see things in the world, when we see objects outside of us all throughout the world, like if I were to say to you, think of what church looks like, you can think of it. You have an image in your mind of what church looks like. You were there, you saw it, and when you go home, you bring an idea with you. And you have an image in your mind that you bring with you. And you have thousands and thousands, maybe millions of these mental images, which are called ideas. And what we do as we grow and as we communicate and study is we learn that there are names for just about every single thing that we ever see. And we learn over time in our lives, we learn to name all of our ideas. Okay? So we have thoughts, we have ideas, and these are mental images of things that we have sensed. All right? And our minds just keep a store of these ideas. And we have many ideas that we don't have names for. There are many things that you can think about and picture, but you don't know what it is. So the ideas are in our minds, and we have to study and learn in order to assign names to those things. There are also many ideas in your heads that you have wrong names for. You call it this, but that's actually not its name. And the names that you have in your mind are actually false. So one of the purposes of study is to learn the names of things, to learn the true names. And Aristotle explains this, like I said. When we get started in classical reasoning, Aristotle talks about this because this is important for reasoning. But what I want you to think about is that there are objects, for example, outside the house there's a tree. And you look at this tree, you see this tree, you might see it from all different sides, you might stand under the tree, whatever. You see this tree, and then you walk away with an idea of that tree. Okay? You walk away with an idea of that tree, but you don't necessarily know the name of that tree. Or you might name that, so I'll draw a speaking bubble here. You might name it tree. And that's good generally, but really that's just the class to which this thing belongs. Right? It's a tree, because you know what? Right behind this tree is another tree. And now you've got two images in your mind. And you call both of them with the same name, and they're obviously not the same thing. Right? They're obviously not the same thing, but you're calling both of them tree. So what has to happen? What has to happen is you have to learn more names. Your ability to name things has to get more complicated. Because now you say, well, this, I'm not going to call this tree. I'm going to call this oak tree. And I'm not just going to call this tree, but I'm going to call that pine tree. Okay, or cedar tree, or fir tree. And this could be maple tree or birch tree, and it gets more complicated. And so now, instead of there being one name for this and this, now there's a two-word name for this and a two-word name for this. And as you learn more, like a little baby looks and just says tree, right? But as you learn more about trees, you can now you don't refer to tree anymore. You say oak tree, cedar tree, pine tree, hickory tree, right? We learn to speak more clearly. And we learn to speak more clearly by developing clearer names for things. Okay? And we store up in our minds, by our experiences, we store up in our minds mental images of things that we've seen. For example, you've never been to, let's say, China. And so the mental images in the mind of a person who lives in China, you don't have those same images. And a person in China has never maybe been in America, and so they don't have in their minds mental images that we have from living in America. But there are some things which we have that are the same. For example, people in China and people in America have both seen cats. They've both seen dogs, right? They've both seen an American flag. And we may have the same plants. We may have some of the same trees. And so we have some mental images that are the same, but a lot of mental images that are different. And we have words for these mental images. So even though I may have an image of a cat, and I'm not going to draw a good cat, but there's my cat. Looks kind of like a pig with whiskers, but if that's my cat, and in my mind I have an image of a cat, and in the mind of a Chinese man living on the other side of the planet, he has an idea of a cat, we have two different names for cat. Mine is the English word, his is the Chinese word. But here's what's interesting. We have the same mental images. Do you understand that? People have the same mental images of things that they've seen. But they have different names for them. They may have true names for them in different languages, or they may have false names for them in the same language. So when we get into this, we see first of all, we have mental images based on the things that we have sensed. And your mind is full of these, thousands and thousands, maybe millions. Mental images. And you have names for some of those mental images, and many of those mental images you have no names for. You don't know what they are. You saw them, and the image is in your mind, but you don't know what it is. And through study and experience and conversation, you learn the names for more and more things. Some of them true names, some of them false names, some of them names that are too simple, like tree for all different kinds of trees, and some of them really detailed and specific. But life gets more complicated than that. Your mind gets more complicated than that, because now you start to see different things. Let's take a car. You have a mental image of a car. And if I just say the word car, a mental image comes up in your mind, and it may not be the same as the person sitting next to you. The name car might cause you to think of one specific car and cause someone else to think of a different car. They also may be different colors. They also may be in different places in the image in your mind. Some of you might think about a red car. Some of you might think about a black car when I say the word car. But when I say the word red car, now everyone thinks about a red car. Right? And when I say red sports car, now everyone thinks slightly differently. We think about a red sports car. And our naming gets more and more detailed so that we can speak clearly and can communicate clearly. You see how that happens? The words that I speak, the words that you speak, affect the minds of other people and cause them to think of ideas that can be general and unclear or even false, or they can get more and more exact, more and more detailed as you speak or write and use different words. Now, when I said think of a car, I used one type of word. And when I said think of a red car, I added a different type of word. Okay? And I can keep going, and I can make that image in your mind clearer and clearer, more and more specific by adding more information. You understand that? If I just say red car, is that car sitting still or is that car moving? Probably sitting still. Like you're thinking of a red car in a parking lot or in a garage. But I can make that image in your mind clearer and clearer and clearer by adding more words, different kinds of words. And that's the challenge of communication. That's what grammar helps us to understand scientifically so that we can learn how to paint those pictures in other people's minds to be exactly what we want them to be. You understand that? Think about that. You can cause another person to have the exact image in their mind of what you'd like them to have. Or you can cause a person to have a wrong image in their mind that doesn't agree with what you have in your mind through bad communication. So the first thing we want to think about when we talk about grammar and words and things like that, we want to talk about objects. Objects that exist outside of our minds. The world is filled with them. Then we want to talk about ideas or notions. There's a couple different words used to describe these. Ideas or notions. Mental images that exist in our minds. Our minds are like cameras. They take snapshots and videos of everything we see. Our minds even remember smells. If mom's in the kitchen and she's cutting up oranges, your mind remembers the smell of the orange. And your mind just does this automatically, constantly, all day, every day, just taking records and records and records and records of all the things that you see, smell, hear, taste, touch, and so on. Your mind is constantly working to take all of these mental images, mental records of things. And these are ideas. And then thirdly, we have words. And the purpose of words The purpose of words is to share ideas. If you never needed to communicate to anyone else, if you lived alone and never needed to communicate, you would not need words. You could just live with objects and ideas. You could spend your whole life in complete silence just reflecting on your own ideas. Okay? Objects that exist outside of your mind, ideas that exist in your mind, and then words. Words are signs of ideas. Words are symbols that you speak to name the ideas in your mind. And this goes on in your mind constantly, whether you pay attention to it or not. God created you as a rational animal with understanding, and your mind, the mind that God gave you, is constantly working. Constantly working. Whether you're the laziest, dumbest person in the world or the most diligent student, your mind is constantly working. Constantly collecting images. And I should say that we're responsible for those images that are in our minds. We decide, for many of these things, we decide what images enter our minds. So when you say, is it bad to watch a bad show? Is it bad to watch a bad video? Yeah, you know why? Because those images from those bad shows will be in your mind, and it's your fault that they're in your mind. You could also choose to put good images in your mind. And two different people will have two totally different minds with totally different images. Sometimes it's not in our control. Sometimes people will show us things that we don't necessarily want to see. But the ideas are in our minds. There's objects, ideas, and words. Everybody got that? Make sure you have these three things listed. Objects, ideas, and words. Words are important because they allow us to communicate and share ideas. And in order to do that, we have to learn words. We have to learn names for things. It's interesting that in the Garden of Eden, one of the first things that Adam had to do was name all the animals. Why? Why did Adam need to name all the animals? This is why. So he could speak about them. Right? Man is a social animal. Man was created to live in community. Speaking is a necessary part of human life because we were created to live in community, and therefore language is necessary. We have to speak. We have to know the names of things. Right? And in grammar, what we're going to study in this first part of grammar, we're going to study words. And that's why. Because if we want to share ideas, or if we want to understand other people's ideas, we have to know how to use words correctly to share ideas. Now here's what I want you to follow me on this, because we're going to shift gears here. What we've talked about so far are simple ideas. Simple ideas. And what you learned about in rule number 8 of lesson 1 is that a word is made of syllables, right? Dictio fit e syllabis. A word is made of syllables. Words express simple ideas. Individual words express simple ideas. Sometimes we use more than one word to express a simple idea. All right? And these are like snapshots of different things. But we want to communicate sometimes, we're thinking about more complicated ideas, complex ideas. What you might want to tell your friend about is not just that there is a cat, but you might want to say, the cat killed a squirrel. That might be the idea that you'd like to communicate. You might say, hey, our cat killed a squirrel, and that's the idea. And so now what you need to do is you need to put together ideas. You need to combine ideas together. You have an idea of a cat, right? And you have an idea of a squirrel, and I'm not going to bother trying to draw a squirrel. Just imagine that's a squirrel, right? You have these two simple ideas, cat, squirrel, and you go to someone, let's say your friend, your brother, your sister, and you say, cat, squirrel. Is that effective communication? Now what you've done is you've called up those images in their minds. And when I say that, I want you to pay attention to your thoughts. Cat, squirrel. Cat, squirrel. You're thinking of a cat and a squirrel, right? But there's no relationship. You're just thinking of a cat and a squirrel. But now I can make this idea clear, and I can say, our cat, squirrel. Our cat, squirrel. And now the image changes, and you picture our cat and a squirrel. But my idea that I want to share is more complicated than that. And I need to make it clearer. I can say, our cat kill squirrel. I could talk like a caveman, right? Our cat kills squirrel. You have an image in your mind now of the cat killing a squirrel? Yes or no? Right? Our cat kills squirrel. And that may be all I want to communicate. I want you to think about our cat killing a squirrel. But what if I want to go even further, and I want you to understand that our cat killed a squirrel yesterday, right? I can say, our cat killed squirrel. And by saying killed instead of kill, now the image gets clearer. This happened in the past. But you think it happened just a few minutes ago, and I don't want that. I want you to think more clearly. I want you to know it happened yesterday. So I say, our cat killed squirrel yesterday. Now, you have the image in your mind that I wanted to communicate. Our cat killed squirrel yesterday. It took me 5 words. It took 5 words for me to communicate what I wanted to communicate. It took 5 words for me to communicate what I wanted to communicate. You understand that? Okay? If I would have used only 4 words, the idea that I wanted to communicate would not have been communicated. And I don't need to use 6 words. I don't need to add any other words. Our cat killed squirrel yesterday. I've communicated everything I want to communicate. Okay? I've had to use different kinds of words. Cat and squirrel are simple names for these 2 mental images. Right? Cat and squirrel are 2 simple names. When I say our cat, what does that word mean? Our. It's a pronoun. It symbolizes different people. When I say our, you understand people that I'm talking about. And in your mind, the word our brings up mental images of people. Our cat. Whose cat? My cat. Your cat. Mom's cat. your brother's and sister's cat. The word our stands in the place of names of other people whose images are all in your mind. That's a different kind of word. And then I say killed. Killed. And now all of a sudden, this cat comes into motion. It's in action. I say this cat, our cat, killed. A different kind of word that introduces action and time and motion. And then I add to this the object, killed the squirrel, and then I add another kind of word, yesterday, which says when. When the cat killed. The cat killed the squirrel yesterday. And so without those different kinds of words, I would not be able to communicate with you the idea that I wanted to communicate. You all understand that? Okay? When you think about caveman language, if you want to imitate a caveman, you talk about, this idea of a caveman, what all you have to understand is a caveman would try to communicate without different kinds of words. So it's easy to imitate a caveman. You just only use nouns. Or you only use one form of an action word, and you'll sound like a caveman. Because what is a caveman? A caveman is not a reasonable creature. A caveman is dumb. He doesn't speak like a human being. He shares simple ideas like an unreasonable person. And it's a good debate question whether there ever was such a thing as a caveman. Whether man ever lived as a caveman talking like that. Did Adam live like that? He was the first man. Did he ever live talking, man, cat, kill, squirrel? Did he ever talk like, When I hear that kind of language, I think of Indians in cowboy and Indian movies. They always make Indians talk like that, right? Cat kills squirrel, right? But there's a reason why the Indian would talk like that, and it's because he doesn't know the other man's language. Okay? You understand that? So if you try to talk in someone else's language, you talk like a caveman because you don't know the words. If you were to talk to someone in Spanish and you don't really know Spanish, that's what you would sound like. When someone who doesn't know English tries to talk to you, they don't know all of your words. They have the ideas in their mind and they want to share those ideas with you, but they can't because they don't know all the words. And they sound like a caveman. And so by studying grammar, by studying language, by studying grammar, we learn to communicate more and more clearly. We learn how to use words. We learn different names. We learn different kinds of words. We learn all different details of different kinds of words. And that allows us to communicate our ideas more and more clearly with others. You all understand that? In order to communicate your ideas, you need to have a language with words that allows you to communicate clearer and clearer ideas. And there are going to be times in your life where you've got something very complicated to communicate to someone. You have something very complicated. It's an idea that's very complicated. And if you don't have language skills, you're not going to be able to communicate that complicated idea. And it may be very important. You may not have the ability to communicate an important, complicated idea. And so the reason why we study grammar, is because we want to build our language skills. We want to develop our language skills so that we can communicate any idea to other people. Okay? Yes, you can sit around with some friends or with your siblings, and you can talk to each other like cavemen about simple things. And you can choose to not study grammar, and you can choose to communicate like a caveman. But if you want to be able to communicate more complicated ideas, if you want to be able to speak more clearly, and you want to share the exact ideas in your mind with other people, you have to study language. You have to study grammar. Because these simple mental images are not the only thing that we need to share. Sometimes we need to share more complicated mental images. And this is what Rule 9 speaks about. A sentence is made of words. So we've learned so far about objects, about simple ideas, and about words. But now we learn about a fourth thing. And that fourth thing, sentences or just speech. In a sentence, here's what we do. In a sentence, we join together different ideas to make one big complicated idea. In a sentence, we join together ideas to express a complicated idea, a complex idea. The ideas are symbolized by words, and we join words together to form a sentence or to form speech. And what we want to do is communicate that complex idea clearly. We do that by joining words together. Now we have to be careful because we can only use words that other people know, right? We can only use words that other people know. That makes communication even more difficult. The more that we study together, the more that we learn together, the more we can talk about. Our conversation can get more and more complex. We can talk about more and more complex ideas. And that's why grammar is called the door to all of the arts. And I'd like you to write down this Latin phrase. Janua artium. Janua artium. Janua is the word for a door or a gateway. Artium means of the arts. Grammar is called the Janua artium, the door or the gateway of the arts. And the reason why grammar is called the gateway of the arts is because in order to study and discuss more complicated things, to advance in wisdom, because life is complicated. The truth is complicated. Wisdom is complicated. In order to master different arts, in order to master different sciences, in order to master different subjects of study, you have to have language skills that allow you to understand what wise men have taught and allow you to communicate your ideas with others. When a wise man teaches, it's often difficult to understand because you don't have the language skills necessary to understand the ideas that he's trying to share. He can make efforts to communicate them to you, but sometimes it's just impossible. And a good example of this is found in the Gospels. When Jesus wants to teach us about heavenly things, Jesus was think about it, when Jesus came into the world, he lived in heaven. He knows things that none of us can even understand. And he had to come into the world and teach us about those things. How can he possibly teach us about things that we have never seen? How can he teach us? What he does is he uses parables, right? He uses comparisons. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like this or that. Because Jesus is the great teacher, he finds a way to communicate his ideas to us. Because we don't have his ideas in our minds, and we don't have words that he might have for those ideas. So he has to communicate his ideas to us using images that we have in our minds and using words that we know. But when we learn Jesus' teaching and we study theology, we start to learn the ideas and the names and the words that we need for those studies, and we can enter into more and more complicated studies. And we need to do that in order to become wise in different arts and sciences. And so grammar, or the study of language, is the gateway to the arts. If you don't study grammar, if you don't study language, there's a ceiling on what you're able to learn and understand. And you can't go higher because of your language. The more you study language, the more expert you get in language, the more you're able to study and understand. All right? So, to wrap that all up, that first lesson, everything that I shared up here is in that first lesson. It's just sort of behind the scenes. Okay? The idea of words. Words are names. We have to find ways to name things, and the way that we name them is by spoken sounds. We can only make so many spoken sounds. And so that becomes the sounds we use for our language, and then we have to find a way to represent those sounds in writing. So that number of sounds is joined to a number of symbols in writing. Those are called letters. And then we combine those sounds to make words. And all of our words are spoken. We simply write symbols of our spoken words. We find ways to name things, and we see that Adam did that at the very beginning of the world. One of the first things man ever did was name things. We name things with spoken sounds by joining spoken sounds together to form words or names. And then as we collect lists and lists and lists of names for all of the ideas in our minds, then we're able to join those words together to make more and more complex speech and communicate more complex ideas. And it just keeps going. And I'll add one more thing. Up here. After sentences, the fifth thing, which we learn about in reasoning, are arguments. After we've composed a sentence like a proposition, which is a certain kind of sentence, and you don't need to understand this now, we study this in reasoning. Once we've made sentences, follow me here, don't worry too much about writing that. Once we've learned to make sentences, we've joined words together. Well, we learned words by joining sounds together. So we use sounds joined together to make words. We learn to join words together to make sentences. Well, what's the next step? What if we start joining sentences together, right? When we join sentences together, we can produce arguments. We can describe really complex ideas. Okay? we can start to describe very complex ideas. And they can get more and more and more complex. You ever hear the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words? You know that saying? A picture is worth 1,000 words. Because when you look at a picture, there's so much stuff in that picture that it would take 1,000 words to share that idea with somebody else. And so sometimes a picture can be worth 1,000 words. But we can share even more complex ideas than can be shared in a picture. And that's why the ancient Egyptians, when they wanted to share ideas, they used pictures. But their way of sharing ideas can't even compare with our way of sharing ideas, because words are way more effective for sharing ideas than pictures. We use pictures to share ideas when people don't understand words, right? That's why children's books tell stories with pictures. And when you become more mature, you should be able to move away from pictures and just read. And so when a kid says, "Oh, I want a book with pictures," that should be embarrassing to you, because you're basically saying you're like a child that can't understand words. You don't need pictures in books if you have language skills, right? You can develop the ideas in your own mind, in your own imagination, by reading words. You don't need picture books. Pictures can be worth 1,000 words, but you can communicate much more complicated ideas than pictures with words. All right? So I want you to have this whole system in your mind when we talk about language. There are objects in the world that God created. And we've talked about visible objects, but there are also invisible objects. There are invisible ideas that you can picture in your mind. For example, ready? I'm going to say a word, and I want you to think about the image that comes in your mind when I say this word. Think about the image, or think about the word love. Love. Is love a visible image? Not really, right? Not really. It's sort of an invisible thing, but you can start to think about images with the word love. And if I say the word hate, if I say anger, jealousy, even though these things are not physical objects, these words represent ideas that you can in some different way see in your mind. So objects aren't necessarily physical things. If I say angel, how can you think of an angel? It's not a physical thing. It doesn't have a body, but you can understand the idea of an angel. And the greatest example of this is God himself. How can you think of God? He doesn't have a body. But for some reason, when I say the word God, there's a mental idea of what God is. And by study, that idea can become clearer and clearer. So first, there are objects that exist in the world. We experience these objects, we experience them, and we develop simple ideas. Names for things. It's what little babies do. Little babies, you show them, they say cup, juice, apple, cat, dog. And as soon as little babies start to speak, they start learning to name things, right? That's how learning starts, by learning the names of things. And we collect this whole store in our minds of ideas, and we start to learn names for all those ideas, and then things start to get more complicated, right? Like, there's 2 kinds of juice on the table, and the baby can't just yell juice, because what the baby actually wants is the grape juice. And when the baby says juice, someone grabs the apple juice, and then the baby's mad because that's not what she wants. And how does she let us know that she wants the grape juice? She might just point at it, because that's how a caveman does it, right? Because The baby doesn't have the word for grape juice. All she knows is juice. And then eventually she learns, oh, it's grape juice. And now it's much easier to say, I want grape juice. Right? And you see, as the language develops, the communication becomes clearer. And that continues through our entire lives. I'm 47 years old. I'm still learning new words, new expressions. I'm having experiences in my life that make my thoughts more and more complex, and I have to learn how to communicate those thoughts. The same process that started when I was a baby is still going on, and it will continue going on for my entire life, for your entire life. You understand that? Simple ideas lead to words. Words are joined together to express more complicated ideas through sentences. And once we learn to make sentences, we can then learn to combine sentences to make arguments. We can write stories. Okay? It can get more and more complex as we grow in our language skills. So all of that being said, we now come to this second lesson. And I've already talked for 51 minutes, and this lesson is actually very short, lesson 2. But now you'll see why lesson 2 is so important. Lesson 2, the title is Partes Orationis. Partes Orationis. That translates as the parts of speech. These are the parts that we use to build speech. The parts of speech. Now, if our ideas are symbolized by words, how many words are there? There's an infinite number of words, right? And so if we wanted grammar, if grammar is the gateway of the arts, and we have to learn language in order to study all different arts, how in the world could we possibly study language if there's names for every single thing we can see or imagine? How could we ever learn language? It would take eternity because there are infinite numbers of words. So we can't study grammar. We can't learn language by studying words individually and just memorizing thousands and thousands, maybe millions of words. We can't learn language by the study of individuals. And we never learn anything through the study of individuals. What we do is we study and reflect on words, and what we find is that when we think about words, just like when we think about sounds, like I said before, there are only so many sounds we can make. There are not a million sounds you can make. You really can't make more sounds than we find in our alphabet symbolized by letters. When we start naming names, when we start listing words, we can list thousands and thousands of words. But what's interesting is when we list all of those words, what we find as we list all those words, we find that there are only 8 different kinds of words. Right? There are only 8 different kinds of words. And so if we want to study language, we could try to memorize and study every single word, which is impossible. Or we can study these 8 classes and learn about these 8 classes, and then when we know about these 8 classes, understand all of the words inside each of those classes, or at least know something about something important about each of those words. Okay? And these 8 classes, we divide all words into these 8 classes, and we refer to these as the 8 parts of speech. These are the 8 parts from which speech is built. Speech is made of words, thousands or millions of words, but all of those words can be divided into 8 different classes. And what wisdom teaches us to do is not try to study every individual word, but to study the classes of the words, to understand the nature of these different kinds of words, because that helps us to understand all words. So in lesson 2 here, chapter 2, we study the parts of speech, partes orationis. And in the first rule, we read, partes orationis sunt octo. Partes orationis sunt octo. The parts of speech are 8. There are 8 parts of speech, 8 different kinds of words. And you then have a list of these words. And the order of the list is important, so don't think that you can just learn the 8 different names in any order. They're listed in an important order. Make sure you learn them in this order. Nomen is the first one. Pronomen is the second one. Verbum is the third, and participium is the fourth. And this group of 4 is important, as we'll see. The second group of 4 listed there in rule number 1 of chapter 2, prepositio, prepositio. The 6th that's listed, adverbium. Interjectio and conjunctio. These are the 8 parts of speech, the 8 different kinds of words that exist in language. And again, you will not be able to think of any others. You will not be able to think of a word that doesn't belong to these 8 different classes. Okay? Wise men made this list, and you're not going to find a word that doesn't fit in this list. They didn't just make it up. It isn't some artificial lesson for a school, some baby rule that oversimplifies things. It's the truth about language. There are 8 parts of speech, at least in Latin. Now to quickly get into what these are, nomen is the Latin word for name. You can use the English word noun. We could say noun, but really all that a nomen is a name. A name. A name, remember I had the image of the ideas? A noun is simply a name for an idea. The simple names. Pronomen is a word that is used in place of a name. Pro means in place of, nomen just means name. So a pronomen is a word that's used in place of a name. And I gave you an example of that before when I said our cat. The word our stands in the place of different people's names. Pronomen, for a name, in place of a name. Verbum, strangely, just means word. And that's strange because we have a class of words that's named word. The reason why this part of speech, this class is called the word, is because sentences are made of words, and you cannot make a sentence without this kind of word. A verb is a word that is necessary for a sentence to exist. A verb is the only part of speech that can be spoken by itself and make a sentence. You got that? Just like a vowel can be spoken by itself, a verb is the only kind of word that can be spoken by itself and make a sentence. Participium, translates as participle. It's called a participle because it participates or shares in the qualities of both a noun and a verb. A participle is a word that has some of the characteristics of a noun and some of the characteristics of a verb. It expresses action, it expresses time, and so it's like a verb. But it's also used to name things, and therefore it's like a noun, a participle. Okay? A noun expresses no time. A pronoun expresses no time. A verb expresses time. But a verb is not used to name something. These are used to name something. A participle expresses time and names something. Okay, so a participle shares in the qualities of these parts of speech. Got that? Now on to the next set. Prepositio. Positio means position or place, right? Positio, that's easy. Position. Pre means before. So prepositio means a word that is placed before another word. Placed before a name. It's a word, remember before I was explaining that when we have a complex idea, we need to add more and more words. And I said, our cat killed the squirrel yesterday. Right? And I said, we need 5 words. Our cat killed squirrel yesterday. But what if I want to add more detail? What if I want to tell you where the cat killed the squirrel? I could say, our cat killed squirrel yesterday, backyard. Right? Does that add more detail to the image? But it's clumsy to say backyard, and it can be confusing in different sentences if there's a bunch of nouns listed and we don't explain the relationship between them. The preposition allows us to explain the relationship. So I could say, our cat killed squirrel yesterday in backyard. And now that's clear. The preposition in explains the relationship between the word backyard and the rest of the sentence. Understand that? Okay? And it's called a preposition because it's always put before the word that it's used to add to the sentence. Adverbium. Verbium is obviously derived from verbum. Ad means next to or in addition to. So it's a word that's added to a word. An adverb is a word that's added to a word. Some people will say an adverb is a word that's added to a verb, but that's not true. It can also be added to a noun. It can also be added to other parts of speech. So don't learn that an adverb is a word used to describe a verb. That's not true. It's a word that's added to another word to explain how something is done. So if I want to say something more complicated, I can say, our cat killed squirrel yesterday in backyard quickly. I can add another word and make it even clearer. I can tell you how by adding the adverb quickly. Killed quickly. Adverb. Explains how. Next, interjectio. Inter means between, right? If I say this is international, we're having an international meeting. It means a meeting between different nations. International. Inter. And yectio means placed or thrown, right? Like a projector throws forth an image. Okay? This idea, yectio, means to throw or to put, and then inter means between. An interjection is a word that expresses an emotion in between other words. You understand that? Okay, an emotion that's expressed in the midst of speech. So it expresses an emotion in speech. It's rhetorical. It's used when we're writing and we're trying to add some kind of emotional quality to what we're writing. And lastly, conjunction, junctio. In rule number 4 of lesson 1, we saw the word juncte, which means joined. Same word here. Junctio means joining together. And con means together, together with. A conjunction is a word that joins together other words or other sentences or other paragraphs. A conjunction is a word that joins other words together or that joins speech together. Those are the 8 different kinds of words. And we're going to study them all through Latin grammar. You will not be able, at least in Latin, remember this is Latin grammar, there are 8 parts of speech. You will not be able to find a Latin word that does not belong in one of these 8 groups. There are no other words, no other kinds of words. Every single Latin word belongs to one of these 8 groups, the 8 parts of speech, the 8 different kinds of words that are used like parts to build speech. And just to wrap up here, you see in the example that I used, our cat killed squirrel yesterday in backyard quickly. Wow. Right? That's an interjection. Okay? And you can see that we started with a simple pair of ideas. We said cat, squirrel. And you had an idea. And then we said our cat, squirrel. And the idea got clearer. And then we said our cat, kill, squirrel. And then it got clearer. We said our cat killed squirrel. Our cat killed squirrel yesterday. Our cat killed squirrel yesterday in backyard. Our cat killed squirrel yesterday in backyard. Wow. The idea gets clearer and clearer and more complex as we go along. And that's still a little caveman-ish, right? There's still a little more to add to that sentence. But you have the image in your mind developing and getting clearer and more complex as we add more of the parts of speech. Okay? That's how language works. It allows us to communicate complex ideas to others in ways that we can control, so there's no confusion, so others don't misunderstand what we say or have an image in their minds that's not the image we want them to have. Right? Okay, so the last thing in lesson 2, of these 8 parts of speech, these four are said to be declined, and these 4 over here are undeclined. It's the last bit of information in lesson 2. And what that means is that these 4 parts of speech, these 4 kinds of words, have different forms, and those different forms allow us to communicate even more complex ideas. These 4 parts of speech have different forms. Okay? These 4 parts of speech do not have different forms. They're just individual words. So these are studied like vocabulary. You just learn the word and its meaning. These, we have to learn the word and its meaning, but we also have to learn the meaning of all of its different forms. And that's what we're going to study throughout grammar. Okay? The study of etymology, which is the second part of grammar, etymology, is the study of the forms of the declined parts of speech. Etymology is the study of the forms, the different forms of the parts of speech. All right? And that, at last, is going to be the end of this short little lesson 2. Right? Lesson 2 looks short, but there's a lot of information packed into that little lesson. So that's all for lesson 2 of Latin grammar.